Hello and welcome back to Witch Witch by Eva Ibbotson, a reading of it. This is part 3 of 3, chapters 14 to 21, the end of the book. If you want to listen to part 1, part 2, there's links in the description box below. It's perfect. Perfect, perfect, perfect. Perfect jacket. Chapter 14. Madame Olympia got 9 out of 10 for her Symphony of Death, as near full marks as could be. The ghoul loved her trick, and though Mr. Chatterjee's teeth went on chattering for a long time inside his bottle, he too thought she was very, very clever. Not even the nastiest Caliph, the Arabian Nights, had done anything more horrible. Why did I only give her 9 out of 10? Ahriman asked himself that evening. Why not full marks? Because it was he who had held back. The other two had been willing to go the whole hog and give her the last mark also. What had prevented him, he wondered. For certainly no witch could touch her for darkness, and the style, the flair, those strobe lights, and that single rat left in the middle of the floor, eating its own flesh. Standing there in his dressing gown, Ahriman remembered her low and evil laughter. Very attractive it was, really, and that proud toss of her head. No one could beat her, that was for sure. There was only one witch to go, and from what he had heard, she was just a slip of a thing, not to be taken seriously. No, witch number 6 would be Mrs. Canker, all right. She'd known it herself. Ugh. That was a very fine show today, didn't you think, Lester? He said to the ogre who was running his bath. Lester came out of the bathroom looking steamy and tired. Very fine, sir, he said, his voice expressionless. Those flickering lights and the skeletons and those giant fleas, I really rather liked them, didn't you? Very much, sir. Of course, some people would have thought it wasn't necessary to make the rats actually eat each other up like that. I mean, I myself have never gone in for that sort of thing. No, sir. But you couldn't have anything blacker, and she was quite good looking, I think. I didn't see any warts, did you? Or whiskers? And I'm almost sure she wasn't wearing wellies. No, she wasn't wearing wellies, sir. So I'm very glad she's won. Well, she's sure to have. Very glad indeed. I think she'll make me an excellent wife. I shouldn't think she'll get things to eat each other very much once we're married. They'll be just straightforward blighting and smiting, wouldn't you think? Yes, sir. Your bath is ready, sir. You're not very forthcoming tonight, Lester. What's the matter with you? I'm a little tired, sir. Are you? Well, I'll tell you what. Fetch Ledbetter's nephew, Terence. He can scrub my back for me. A nice boy. I'm fond of him. I'm afraid he isn't here, sir. And Lester, after a short pause, said, He's gone to visit his mother. Has he? Dear me, that'll be Ledbetter's sister, I suppose. Pity. He'd have enjoyed today, I think, said the magician, untying his dressing gown cord. Were those human teeth she was wearing around her neck? Undoubtedly, sir. Yes, I thought so. It's a new fashion, I suppose. I mean, one must keep up with the times. Ahriman took off his trousers, his socks and his shoes, and was just about to start on his underpants when he heard the usual pashing sound behind the wainscot. Oh, my God, said Lester, who was not in the mood for Sir Simon. But before he could make his getaway, the wicked spook came wavering through the panelling and thrust his pallid, guilty face at Ahriman. Hello, hello, said the magician, cheering up, as always, at the sight of his friend. I've great news for you. I've found a truly black witch. Looks like a certain winner. The spectre stood in silence, his eye sockets dark and inscrutable. I know you aren't into marriage much, but you'll like her. Great style. She did this amazing trick where all these rats ate each other up. Of course, it's not for people with weak stomachs. Still silent, the spectre stood and plashed. Oh, blast you, said Ahriman, suddenly furious. Why don't you say something? The wizard was in his bath, and Lester, who'd finished scrubbing his back, was out in the corridor talking to Mr. Ledbetter, when a cry of anguish filled the air. Lester, come back! It's trying to get in the bath with me. Take it away. Lester did not move. Aren't you going to go to him? Said Mr. Ledbetter. Not likely. But it's the Kraken. It's trying to get into the bath with him. I know it's the Kraken. It always tries to get into the bath with him. But, began Mr. Ledbetter, as another despairing cry came from Ahriman. Look, said the ogre, rubbing his eye patch. Last night the bloke sent 7 princesses back to 7 different countries. 3 of them had been blinking budgies, lame duck and a penguin before he got them. A month ago he brought down a ton of toads on the tax inspector's hatchback. What's to stop him sending the Kraken back to the sea, or turning him into an umbrella stand or something? You mean he likes being followed about and so on? Likes it, said the ogre. He loves it, laps it up, can't get enough. You mark my words. If he marries and has a kid, he'll be the biggest sucker in the world. Anyone calling that bloke daddy and he's a goner, devilry and wizardry or not. Well, that's adorable. They both fell silent. The thought of Ahriman's marriage lay like a stone on their chests, for Terence hadn't returned yet, and even if he did manage to hire an actor, was there really any hope that they'd manage to deceive Ahriman? Will you stay if he marries Madame Olympia? Asked Mr. Ledbetter, who could hardly bring himself to say the enchantress's name. Lester shook his craggy head. Don't think I could, he said. Goodness knows it goes against the grain to leave the poor bloke, but she really gives me the creeps. I wouldn't put it past her to turn me into a blooming baboon and get me to eat myself into the bargain. It's the boy I'm worried about, said Mr. Ledbetter. If anything happens to Terence, Belladonna will never get over it. It won't, said the ogre. He may be Nat-sized, but he's got a head on his shoulders, that boy. Even now, I wouldn't put it past him to bring home the bacon. I hope you're right, Lester, said the secretary, rubbing his aching tail. I do very much hope so. Lester was right. No harm had befallen Terence, and midday had found him ringing the doorbell of Amelia Ledbetter's terrace house on the outskirts of Todcaster. At first, when he had seen again the dreary houses and mean streets of the town where he'd been so unhappy, Terence felt uneasy and afraid. Miss Ledbetter's boarding house was not far from Sunnydale home, and when Terence thought of Matron and her bullying, it was as though the last exciting days at Darkington had never been. But then he remembered that he was there to help Belladonna and not to worry about himself, and it was with renewed courage that he rang the doorbell. Miss Ledbetter might not have a tail, but she was a brisk and sensible woman, and when she had read the note that her brother had written and given Terence a cup of tea and a tuna sandwich, she got down to business. Now, it says here that you want an actor to play a part in a show up at the hall, someone tall and used to costume work. Is that right? Terence nodded. If he could be used to talking in that old-fashioned way, you know, with haths and quotas and things in it. Shakespearean, Amelia Ledbetter nodded. Well, there's plenty of unemployed actors around. It's not a comic you want then, it's a straight lead. Oh yes, he plays a knight in armour. It's a very good part, sort of a starring part. And it's got to be someone who can keep a secret. Now, let's see. She leaned across and filled Terence's mug once more with scalding tea. There's Bert Danby, but he's a boozer, and you can never trust a boozer. Then there's Dave Lullingworth. He's down doing cat food adverts on the telly, but Dave would tell you the life story of a brick wall. Wait a minute. I've got it. Yes, Monty Moon. He's a bit long in the tooth now, but with the right makeup, he'll pass. Monty hasn't worked for years, but he was at Stratford once. In fact, I'm not sure he didn't play the ghost in Hamlet. Terence was very excited. He sounds just right, he said. An actor who was actually used to playing ghosts was more than he had hoped for. So Amelia rang up Mr. Moon, who, by good luck, was at home and agreed to come round immediately. Monty Moon turned out to be tall and pale and stooped, with a large balding head and a way of tucking in his chin so that it didn't show any sags or wrinkles. When he saw Terence, he looked a little surprised and a little stuffy, but when he saw the wallet Terence had laid casually open on the table, he got a lot less stuffy at once. 5 minutes later, they were deep in conversation. Now, I understand I'm playing a wicked wife-slaying spectre who suddenly finds himself brought back to life. Is that correct? That's right. Fill me in, dear boy, fill me in. I must get right inside the part. How many wives have I slain? What sort of armour do I wear? Am I blood-stained? So Terence told him everything he could think of about Sir Simon, and Mr. Moon wrote it all down in his little notebook. And he doesn't wear a helmet or anything, finished Terence. The top of his head is clear, and so are his hands, so that he can beat his forehead with a pashing sound. Like this, said Mr. Moon, bringing his arm around in a sweep and striking dramatically at his forehead. Well, yes, but it makes a sort of softer sound, sort of sloshier. Don't worry, dear boy, I'll get it right on the night. Now, what about the sound effects? Anything special you want when I appear? Howling dogs, tempests, crowing cockerels, just say the word. They went on discussing things for another hour and deciding what Terence should get ready in the way of skulls, necromancy, incense, and so on. For while it had been all right for Belladonna to write nothing on her list when she had Rover to rely on, now that her trick was being faked, the more props there were, the better. When Mr. Moon heard that he was to get £500 now, and another 500 if he succeeded in convincing everybody that he was the real Sir Simon brought back to life, he promised of his own accord to bring an electrician and a stage manager with their own van who could help him set things up. You'll see, dear boy, it'll be a first-rate show. I always did my best work in costume parts. Now just draw a little map for me to show me how we can get into the hall the night before and rig up 1 or 2 effects. A trapdoor would have been nice, but one can't have everything. When they finished, Terence went back to thank Miss Ledbetter. Returning to say goodbye to Mr. Moon, he found the actor still standing in the middle of the room, bringing his arm in a sweep around his forehead, practicing his pashing sound. And knowing that he had found somebody who took his work seriously, Terence went away contentedly. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15. Ahriman awoke on the Sunday before Halloween with a headache. Like Terence, he had had a dream, and a dream with teeth in it. He'd seen a necklace floating in the air with 5 brand new molars in it, cusps, fillings and all. Ahriman had known at once that they were his teeth, and he'd started making teeth-calling noises, like the noises you call cows in to be milked with, or chickens to be fed. But the teeth wouldn't come to him. They sort of sneered and floated away, and then Ahriman woke and had been almost glad to hear from under the lid of the soup tureen the muffled cries of "Daddy, Daddy," with which the kraken greeted the dawn. Mr. Chatterjee was already breakfasting inside his bottle, looking cheerful and relaxed. The climate of the north of England didn't really suit him, and as soon as Witch number 7 had done her trick, he was going to fly home back to Calcutta. Well, we've got a free day, said Ahriman, who was always jolly at breakfast. Witch number 7's not doing her trick until tomorrow night. Myself, I think I'll do a little smiting and blighting today. I'm getting short of exercise. What about you, Sniveller? But the ghoul, sitting hunched and exhausted over his kidneys, didn't answer. He almost never did. So Ahriman went off and blighted some fir trees and cleft some boulders in twain and called in thunderstorms from the west. Clean, old-fashioned magic, which he enjoyed, and thought how nice it had been when the wizard watcher sat peacefully at the gate and his oak trees hadn't been filled with sleeping grocers and lost witches hadn't been bubbled about in bottomless holes on his east lawn. Well, tomorrow it's all going to be over, he thought. Tomorrow I'll know for certain who my wife is going to be. No, I'm being silly, I know now. After which he went to find Mr. Ledbetter to ask him for some milk of magnesia tablets. Magician or not, Ahriman had a stomachache. Meanwhile, down at the campsite, Belladonna sat wretchedly by the campfire, facing the fact that Ahriman the Awful was lost to her forever. Even before the enchantress did her trick, Belladonna had not really hoped to win, though when Terence was with her, she did sometimes feel confident and strong. Now, all hope was gone. She reached for the magic mirror. Ahriman was gulping down some small white pills. He looked tired and anxious, but what was that to her? It would be Madame Olympia now who'd comfort him and smooth his curse curl from his furrowed brow. I don't think she's going to do that. Her sad thoughts were interrupted by a fierce rocking noise from behind her, followed by a scrabble and a swoosh, and Mother Bloodwort crawled out from Belladonna's tent, her flies sticking like a doormat around her head. The old witch had been a coffee table far too long, and as she collapsed onto the camp stool that Belladonna pulled out for her, she looked very battered and confused. "What happened?" she asked, blinking. "Was the last one a swan?" "I'm afraid not," said Belladonna gently. "It was a budgerigar, a very intelligent one. It asked for a biscuit." "Not the same, though, is it?" the old witch remarked. "Don't know where I went wrong. Didn't get a very high mark, I suppose. Well, 3 out of 10. Not bad, really. More than I'll get, anyway." Mother Bloodwort kicked off her slippers so that the fire could get at her bunions and stared sadly into the flames. "It wouldn't have made any difference if you'd managed the swan bit," said Belladonna, trying to comfort the old woman, "because Madame Olympia would have won anyway. She did this absolutely terrifying thing with rats. The Symphony of Death, it was called. She got 9 out of 10. No one can possibly beat her." "The Symphony of Death, eh?" said Mother Bloodwort thoughtfully. "I've heard of that. Very black. That is, very nasty. There's not too many witches could do that even in my day. I should think she'll gobble up poor Ahriman as soon as look at him. Good job he's got nice teeth." "Oh, no, don't say that," cried Belladonna. "Ahriman's the mightiest wizard in the world. She couldn't hurt him. She couldn't." "Oh, well, maybe not," said Mother Bloodwort. She sighed. "I suppose marriage wouldn't really have suited me. I've lost the habit, I reckon, and that turning myself young again spell doesn't seem to be up to much." She got up creakily, went to fetch her tin with the coronation on the lid, and began to shake her head into it, blowing on the flies as they fell to change them back into maggots. "Best be getting ready for lunch, I suppose." But before Mother Bloodwort could move, Ethel Feedbag and Mabel Rack came lurching up to them, both heaving with rage. "Look," said Mabel, putting down the bucket in which she was taking Doris for a midday stroll and pointing with a shaking arm at the enchantress's caravan. "Stuck-up snooty cow," raged Ethel Feedbag. Belladonna looked up, frowning. "How strange," she said. "Madame Olympia's caravan was the kind with a little stove and a chimney, and of course, as she was a witch, the smoke from her chimney was blowing against the wind. But that wasn't what made Ethel and Mabel so mad. Madame Olympia had magicked the smoke so that it came out in letters. The letter O followed by the letter C again and again, standing out as clear as could be against the deep blue sky of autumn." "What does it mean?" asked Belladonna, puzzled. "What do you think it means?" snarled Mabel Rack. "Those are her new initials, of course. Olympia Canker. She's letting us all know she's won." "But she hasn't won. She hasn't." The voice was a new one, and Belladonna, hearing it, sprang to her feet. "Terence, I'm so glad you're back. You've no idea how much I missed you." But though he hugged her as lovingly as always, Terence's mud-coloured eyes were fixed on the enchantress's chimney, and his jaw was set. "You're going to beat her, Belladonna. You're going to get 10 out of 10 tomorrow. You'll see." End of chapter 15. Chapter 16. In the great hall at Darkington, the clock struck 11, an hour until the true beginning of Halloween, the Feast of the Dead. When the shades of the departed draw closer for a few dread hours to those they have left behind. In a dozen sconces the tall candles burned, with a sickly flame. Logs of gnarled and knotted alderwood, like ancient severed limbs, hissed and spat in the grate, and the wind, howling through the rafters, eerily stirred the tapestry of the gentleman being shot with arrows while being burned at the stake. Belladonna, waiting her turn, was as white as a sheet under her gown and mask. Terence had taken her through the trick again and again. He'd told her that everything would be ready, laid out on the great table covered with a cloth, and that he himself would be hidden beneath it, ready to hand her over at the right moment and prompt her if she forgot anything. And waiting behind a tall embroidered screen with the other witches, she could see that he'd been as good as his word. The table with its candlesticks, its grinning skull, and its portrait of Sir Simon looked just like one of those dreadful necromancy altars she had seen in books. But that only made her more horribly afraid of the deed she was about to do. "Witch number 7, step forward," commanded Mr. Ledbetter. The secretary was looking tired and careworn. However much he argued with himself, it seemed to him that cheating was not the same as wizardry and darkness. Cheating, whichever way you looked at it, was mean. And what if Monty Moon let them down, and all they'd done was make Belladonna look a fool? But Belladonna, trying to stop her knees from trembling, was walking towards the judge's table and, pulling himself together, Mr. Ledbetter said, "Announce your trick." Belladonna turned and bowed low to the judges. Her voice shook a little at the first words, but she lifted her head bravely, and her clear young voice reached even the farthest corners of the hall. "I am going to bring Sir Simon Montpelier back from the dead," said Belladonna, allowing herself a lingering look at Ahriman as he sat, brooding and a little bored, between the other two judges. But at her words, the magician leaned forward, frowning furiously, and a spurt of fire burst from his left ear. Going to do necromancy, was she? A deed so difficult that he, Ahriman the Awful, had failed at it again and again. A little slip of a witch, not up to his shoulder. How dare she? For a moment, it looked as though Ahriman was going to make a scene. But even as he brought his fist down, ready to bang it on the table, his curiosity got the better of him. It was impertinence, of course, the most appalling cheek. Still, it wouldn't hurt to let her try. Perhaps she had guessed how achingly he longed for his pashing, ghostly friend. So Belladonna stepped forward to the table with its long cloth and candlesticks and skull, and as she did so, Terence slipped Rover's closed box into the pocket of her gown. Then she took a pin from the other pocket and, jabbing it into her finger, let a drop of blood fall, like a red pearl, into the incense pot. And immediately there was a flash, and a sheet of red and amethyst and orange smoke rose almost to the roof. "Thank God," said Lester, who believed that if you had to cheat, it was best to cheat good and proper. He'd heard a van drive into the courtyard at dawn, but that was the only sign of Monty Moon and his crew, and he'd begun to have his doubts. "Let there be darkness," said Belladonna, and instantly every candle guttered and went out, and the hall was plunged into inky, impenetrable night. Belladonna let the darkness and silence stay there for a moment, making everyone's flesh crawl a little. Then she took up the hollow skull and walked over to the magic triangle that Terence had chalked out for her below the tapestry. "Do you hear me, shades of the underworld?" cried Belladonna, raising the skull. They heard her. First came a low and fearful murmuring that swelled to a cacophony of cackling, screaming and screeching. And under the table, Terence sighed with relief. Mr. Moon had been as good as his word. Better even. Belladonna's teeth were chattering badly now. It seemed that Terence was right, and that with Rover to help her, there was no limit to her darkness. But she went on bravely, and putting down the skull, she fetched the portrait of Sir Simon and held it aloft. "I call upon thee, shades, to release from eternal torment the spirit of this man," she intoned. More screams and yells from the spirits, while in the rafters the ravens hideously croaked. "Sir Simon Montpelier, Knight of Darkington, I command thee to appear, cried Belladonna. The jabbering and screeching died away, and now, in the black silence of the hall, there appeared a series of white, disembodied lights that bobbed and flickered, giving off at the same time an almost unendurable stench of decay. Corpse candles, murmured Mother Bloodwort, drawing her skirt away from one which had come too close. Then, all in the same second, the corpse candles went out, and over the hall there spread a coldness, such as they had never experienced before. The coldness of a tomb, the grave of death itself. I wonder how he did that, murmured Lester, whose respect for Mr. Moon was growing every minute. Some sort of chemical, I suppose. But now the coldness was passing, and everyone's gaze was drawn upwards to the wall on the left of the chimney breast. For the tapestry of the man struck with arrows while burning at the stake was beginning to glow and shine and shimmer with the most unearthly light. Belladonna felt in her pocket for one last squeeze of Rover's box. She was incredibly tired and her knees felt like water, but she wouldn't weaken now. And taking up a wand from the table, she struck the ground thrice and, prompted by Terence, who had been whispering the spell along with her, she said the words that are older than any book of magic in the world. Alle forticion, fortitio rua, cried Belladonna. The glow around the tapestry grew stronger. The clock struck midnight, and as the last chime died away, there crept around the edge of the hanging, slowly and gropingly, a hand, a white hand, limp and long-fingered, with an emerald riding one knuckle. For a few moments the hand just hung there. Then it felt for the sides of the tapestry, and with a sudden violent gesture, tore it from the wall and threw it to the ground. And there, stepping from the stone recess, wan and weary, but definitely alive, the figure of an Elizabethan knight. A shriek of joy from Ahriman broke the stunned silence. "Sir Simon, is it really you?" he cried, pushing back his chair so hard that it crashed to the ground, and dashing forward, he seized the spectre's hand in his own. "Aye, 'tis I," intoned Sir Simon. His voice was high and reedy, like an oboe playing something sad. "Ye see before ye the guilty, tainted flesh of Sir Simon Montmorency, Montpellier." "Oh, I can't believe it, but yes, I can feel you. You're solid. And look at the vein throbbing in your left temple. Oh, happy, happy day. What ecstasy, what bliss." Sir Simon removed his left hand from Ahriman's grasp and brought it up to his forehead. The pashing sound was much, much better than when he'd been a ghost, more solid, wetter, in every way more real. Ahriman was quite overcome. The talks we'll have, the confidences, the walks, the delights of nature we will share. My dear, dear fellow, this is the best day of my life. Then, remembering at last that this was a competition, Ahriman turned to the other judges. 10 out of 10, gentlemen. Are we agreed?" The ghoul nodded. He'd have liked the whole world to be inhabited by people who were dead, and kind Mr. Chatterjee smiled. But these words were never heard by Belladonna. Overcome by fatigue, terror and strain, Belladonna had fainted. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17. Belladonna woke in a four-poster bed in a room at the very top of the North Tower in Darkington Hall. Mr. Ledbetter and the ogre had carried her there after the end of the competition, while Terence hopped around her, worrying about her and congratulating her at the same time. Belladonna couldn't remember much about it now, only that she'd been anxious about the baby rabbits and about not having a toothbrush, and that Terence had said he'd go down to the campsite and see to everything. How long ago had that been, she wondered. It still seemed to be dark, but now she felt refreshed and very happy. She'd done it. She'd won. She was to be the bride of Ahriman, to be with him always, to stroke his moustache and massage his ankles if they swelled, and share his secrets and his hopes and his fears. "Oh, glory," said Belladonna, and smiling, fell asleep once more. But a happy white witch, a white witch blissfully in love can be a disaster. While Belladonna slept, the room began to fill with exquisite saucer-sized snowflakes, each a perfect six-pointed star, and the flakes did not melt but alighted softly on the hangings of the bed, the embroidered rug, the washstand. An enamel music box burst from the chest of drawers and began to play a dreamy Viennese waltz. Strings of gold and silver tinsel draped themselves across the ceiling, and the window sills filled with rows of crystal goblets brimful of Knickerbocker glories. A Knickerbocker glory is like a trifle, an English dessert. But Belladonna, knowing nothing of this, slept on. While Belladonna lay dreaming in the tower, Ahriman sat in the library talking to Sir Simon Montpellier. Ahriman had suggested that the knight might like to slip into something more comfortable than the breastplate and leg armour that he had worn for 400 years, and though he murmured something about his underclothes not quite being the thing, the wife-slave was now wearing Ahriman's second-best dressing gown, a maroon one appliqued with fiends and pitchforks, and was telling the magician the story of his life. "So, the Lady Anne was the first of your wives?" inquired Ahriman, pushing the whisky decanter to his friend. "Even so," agreed Sir Simon. "She was the one I drowned. The cock crowed thrice. I drowned her. I had to. She made the bedchambers rumble as if cleft in twain." "Ah, she snored, you mean," said Ahriman. "Very distressing, that. Nothing worse." The knight nodded and pashed a little. "Then I wedded the Lady Mary. She I took by the throat and fastened my foul fingers around." "Strangulation," Ahriman nodded. "She hath cheated me of my victuals." "Fiddled the housekeeping, did she? In that case she deserved everything she got." "And the next one?" "Next I espoused the fair Olivia. She I walled up in the privy for looking with favour upon the knave who emptied of her slops." Ahriman shook his head. "Terrible, terrible. What you've been through." Sir Simon went on telling the magician about Lady Julia, whom he'd stabbed in the buttery because she had a horrid little dog that yapped, and Lady Letitia, whom he'd thrown over a cliff because she guzzled. And he was just about to start on Lady Henrietta, whom he'd knocked off with a poisoned halibut because she drove him nutty, walking in her sleep, when there was a knock at the door and the ogre entered. "The cracker's in his tureen, waiting for you to say good night, sir." "Well, that's adorable. And I've laid out your pyjamas. Is there anything else you require?" No, Lester, that's fine. You can go to bed. I've put Sir Simon in the green room," said Lester, winking at Mr. Moon, "on account of it being handy for the bathroom, like." Good, said the magician impatiently. There was still one more wife to go, and he wanted to hear about her. "There was a postcard from the Wizard Watcher by the late post, sir," the ogre continued. "It has reached Skegness and hopes to be back the day after tomorrow." Lester had gotten through to the magician at last. "Now that is good news. I'm really glad about that. I wouldn't have liked it to miss the wedding." But the word wedding had a bad effect on Ahriman. His brooding face darkened and he drained his whiskey in a single desperate gulp. "You've no idea what women do, Lester. Sir Simon's been telling me. They snore, they have little dogs, and they walk in their sleep. And those are just the ordinary women. I mean, this witch, she must be really very black to do necromancy. I should think a witch as black as that would have some pretty nasty habits." "Not necessarily, sir," said Lester. "And if she's blacker than me, I mean, I don't want to be henpecked. I can't imagine anything sillier than a henpecked wizard." "Sir," said Lester, losing his patience, "you haven't even seen Witch number 7 yet. And anyway, what about your duty to wizardry and darkness? What about the blighting black baby you're going to have? What," said Lester, "did you even have the blinking contest for?" The magician sighed. Yes, you're quite right, Lester. I'll go and see her first thing in the morning and fix the date." As Lester left the room, Ahriman was leaning forward eagerly and saying, "And the last one? The Lady Beatrice, wasn't it? What did she do?" "Most vilely and horribly hath she smelled," Sir Simon said gloomily. And having come to the end of his wives, the knight poured himself another whisky and began again at the beginning. Ahriman kept to his word, and the next morning saw him climbing the curved steps towards Belladonna's tower. The magician wasn't feeling too good, so Simon had told him about his murdered wives, not once but 3 times, and though Ahriman understood how much the wife-slayer needed to talk after 400 years of only pashing, he did feel very tired. Nor were the ogre and the secretary following him close behind, exactly full of beans. They'd spent the night worrying in case the real Sir Simon burst clanking through the panelling and gave the game away. And they didn't really like the way Monty Moon had settled into his part. That was the trouble with actors. You could get them on stage, but getting them off again was another matter. Ledbetter, you wouldn't lie to me, said Ahriman, turning around. Is she covered in warts? I mean, covered? No, sir, not at all. What about her fingers and toes? All there, are they? No stumps, for example. Nothing webbed or anything. Nothing clawed. No, sir. The magician climbed a few more steps and turned again. And, nothing personal, you understand, because yours is charming, I mean. It's part of you. But it could be awkward in a wife. In short, Ledbetter, has she got a tail? You know, one of those fork jobs, a bit black and bushy. No, sir, said the secretary. Witch number 7 is tailless. And her name is Belladonna. That's right. Belladonna Canker. Oh, well. And he reached the top step. Ahriman paused, took a deep breath, and threw the door open. Belladonna was sitting up in bed. The sun, streaming through the east window, had turned her hair into a shower of gold. Her eyes were bright with happiness and blue as the summer sky, and she was singing a sweet and foolish little song, the kind with roses in it and springtime and love, rather a lot of love. Ahriman stood stock still in the doorway, unable to move. Who, he said, is this? That is Belladonna, sir, witch number 7, the winner of the contest. You're pulling my leg. No, sir, she's not, in an enchanted state. I mean, she hasn't taken on another shape just to bamboozle me. She looks like this all the time. All the time, sir. Belladonna, meanwhile, was gazing rapturously at Ahriman, her heart in her eyes. This was the closest she'd ever been to him, and she was drinking in the flared nostrils, the tufty ears, the curve of his noble nose. Belladonna, said the magician, stepping forward. His voice throbbed, his eyes burned, and his chest heaved like a pair of bellows. Ari, murmured Belladonna shyly from beneath lowered lashes. Ari, all my life I've wanted someone to call me Ari. Lester and Ledbetter exchanged glances. Things were turning out exactly how they'd hoped, but they hadn't reckoned on being quite so embarrassed. Ledbetter, we must be married at once. Tomorrow at the latest, said Ahriman, who was now sitting on Belladonna's bed and grasping both her hands. Mr. Ledbetter sighed. It was just like Ahriman to spend weeks grumbling about having to get married and then falling in love like a ton of bricks and making trouble for everyone. I'm afraid that's impossible, sir. There are wedding invitations to be sent, the food to be ordered, the bride's clothes to be bought. 3 weeks is the shortest I can manage. 3 weeks? I can't wait 3 weeks. Can you wait 3 weeks, my pretty? Oh, my God, muttered Lester. He had forgotten how absolutely ridiculous people sound when they're in love. But now, at last, the really peculiar look of the tower room had gotten through to Ahriman, and without letting go of Belladonna's hand, he looked with surprise at the exquisite snowflakes, the string of gold and silver tinsel, the shimmering moonstones now dripping from the mouth of the wash jug. Catching every movement of her beloved's eyes, Belladonna flushed and said, I'm sorry about all this. It happened while I was asleep. You see, Ari, I feel I should tell you that I used to be white. No, my treasure, said the magician dotingly. That's quite impossible. Your hair is so golden, your cheeks are so pink, and your eyes are such a lovely, lovely blue. I don't mean that, said Belladonna. I mean my magic was white. I was a white witch. She got through to Ari at last. A spasm crossed his face. My dearest love, you mustn't say such a thing. Oh, it's all right. I'm not white now. I'm very, very black. Well, You saw how black I was. Rover made me do it. She broke off with a little cry. Oh, how dreadful of me, how selfish and cruel. I left Rover in his matchbox all night. Oh, poor, poor Rover. He'll be so dry and sad. Terence will never forgive me. She had freed her hands from Ahriman and, jumping out of bed, ran to the chair where her gown was lying. Here it comes, whispered the ogre. Belladonna had found the matchbox, had opened it, and was staring at it while the colour drained from her face. When she spoke, it was in a voice so full of anguish and disbelief that they hardly recognised it. Rover's gone, said Belladonna. He's gone. There was a long and dreadful pause. I have to find him, Ari. I have to. He's my familiar, you see. Without him, I'm nothing. She began to search desperately, lifting up the Knickerbocker glories, pushing aside the snowflakes. Ahriman had started to help her when he saw the ogre beckoning to him from the other side of the room. Sir, said Lester, when he got his master to the other side of the door, it's my belief that it ain't no good looking because the worm ain't lost. He's been stolen. I've thought it all along, but Belladonna's only just noticed that he's gone, said Ahriman, looking puzzled. Lester saw he'd made a mistake. If he told Ahriman that Rover had been gone before they raised Sir Simon, he'd get suspicious at once. Belladonna had made it clear that her blackness came from Rover. So if there was no Rover, there was no blackness. And that led right back to Sir Simon not being Sir Simon at all, but an actor named Monty Moon. I can't go into that right now, sir, he said, but I can tell you one thing. Rover may be a good performer, but he's not up to shutting a matchbox after he's crawled out of it. No, that worm's been nicked, and I'll bet my bottom dollar I know who did it. Who? Witch number 6, that Madame Olympia. Ledbetter thinks the same. Oh, no, surely not. Ahriman was very shocked. The one with the interesting cruel smile and the, rats. Lester nodded. And if I'm right, we ought to be getting down there, down to her caravan quick. The witches are all due to go back tomorrow. Ahriman was frowning. The more he remembered the Symphony of Death, the more he thought it would be better to not meet the enchantress head on. I think we had better take her by surprise, he said, and that means disguises. How would you like to be a rabbit, Lester? Not at all, sir. Oh, come on, be a sport. No, sir, absolutely and definitely no. While Ahriman and the ogre were talking, Madame Olympia was packing her things. Since Belladonna had won the competition, the enchantress had been in such a towering rage that she had made 3 holes in the floor of the caravan where she had stamped her feet. She had also come out in a rash from sheer temper, and it was this that made her decide to go back to London immediately, to her beauty parlour where she could mix more creams and ointments to get rid of it. Then her plan was to come back like the Queen in Snow White with a poisoned apple or some poisoned stays which she could sell to Belladonna at the door and which would kill her, except that probably Belladonna did not wear stays. People did not seem to nowadays, so she would have to think of something else. So now she came out of the caravan to do one last job, and that was to throw some rubbish she did not want into the fire, some nasty, useless, disappointing rubbish that she wanted to get rid of once and for all. And as she did so, a rabbit and a fox ran between her legs and bounded into the caravan. If she had bothered to look, she would have noticed that the fox was an unusually handsome one with a great bushy autumn-coloured tail, and that the rabbit, which looked crossed, had only a single eye. But she only turned around furiously and said, "Get out at once, you dirty animals, shoo!" But of course they weren't dirty animals anymore. Sitting at the table were Ahriman the Awful and the ogre. "Good morning," said Ahriman, polite as always. "How dare you?" screamed the enchantress. "How dare you break in like this?" Ahriman looked at her. The enchantress's power is useless on someone who is truly in love. Ahriman could now see her for who she really was, and he did not like what he saw. "We believe you have something that belongs to my fiancée," said the magician. "Her familiar, to be exact." "Her familiar? What on earth are you talking about? I have a perfectly good familiar of my own, as you can see." Madame Olympia kicked the cowering aardvark with the heel of her shoe. Gosh, she's horrible. Then she shut her eyes and began to gabble something under her breath. But before she could get any further, Lester, following a signal from his master, had taken a full jug of milk and upended it over the enchantress's head. "Phew," sputtered Madame Olympia. "Guggle." Milk is a well-known antidote to magic, almost as good as eating roses or holding a rowan twig. "Quick, search the caravan," ordered Ahriman, while the enchantress, groping for a towel, used some words that even Lester had not heard before. So they searched the caravan, turning out the built-in cupboards, opening Madame Olympia's half-packed suitcase, feeling under the bed. Nothing, not a sign of Rover. "You see," jeered the enchantress. "Turn the caravan inside out for all I care." She flung herself out of the caravan and, picking up a small bundle of rubbish, walked with a gleeful smile towards the fire. It was Ahriman who caught on first and ran after her, the ogre following. "Stop, stop! Let's see what you're burning." "Never!" shouted the enchantress and laughed. Then she brought her arm over in an arc and threw her bundle into the flames. Ahriman did not stop for any spells that would have made him fireproof or any magic words that would have doused the flames. Instead, he plunged his arm into the red-hot blaze and drew the crumpling bundle just as it had begun to catch, and there, dry and bewildered looking, at the bottom of the cornflakes packet was Rover. Belladonna, sitting wistfully in a chair in the tower room, greeted the earthworm with a shriek of joy. But then she saw the magician's hand. "Oh, Ari, you're hurt. That's dreadful." And she took his hand and bent over it and began to croon one of her wholeness songs about the beauty of new skin and the cleverness of having 5 fingers. And almost at once the pain disappeared and blisters were gone. "My angel, my little blossom, you've healed me," said Ahriman, growing more and more besotted. "Yes, but that was the old me," said Belladonna, a.k.a. Rapunzel, hastily. "The new me is quite different, Ari. If you give me Rover, I'll show you." The ogre handed her the worm, which he damped down and fettled up with some moist earth as they came. "What would you like, Ari?" she said. "Shall I turn the tinsel into some mouldering thigh bones, perhaps? Sort of a criss-cross pattern? And what about making the snowflakes into gaping wombs? You do like gaping wombs. I adore them, my angel. They're almost my favourite thing." So Belladonna closed her eyes, while the ogre and Mr. Ledbetter and Ahriman stood and watched. The next half hour was one that none of them ever forgot. Belladonna worked and she worked and she worked, not once letting the strain and puzzlement show on her face, but at the end of the time she put down Rover and threw herself with a wail of anguish onto the bed. "It's hopeless," she cried, quite hopeless. "You must forget me, Ari. You must wed another. My blackness is absolutely and completely gone." The others looked around the room once more. The string of gold and silver tinsel was still there, but between them now sparkled chains of the most delightful fairy dolls. In the centre of each exquisite, still unmelted snowflake shone a diadem of flawless pearls, but it was the pots of pink and rather bobbly flowers which had sprung up all over the place that made Lester's voice, when he spoke, sound like the voice from a tomb. "Begonias," said the ogre, shaking his giant head. "Blooming begonias." It was in this moment of complete despair that Ahriman showed himself a most true and noble lover. "My angel," he said, gathering Belladonna in his arms, "what does it matter? You can fill the whole place with Knickerbocker glories and those, pink bobby things, and it wouldn't bother me at all. All I care about is you." But though she let her head rest for a moment on his manly shoulders, Belladonna was firm. "No, Ari, you have a duty. Remember what the competition was about? Darkness is all, you said. Suppose we had..." Her voice broke, but she pulled herself together. "Suppose we had a white baby, or even a grey one. What would a baby like that do to a devilish maze and a fiendish laboratory and all the other lovely things you've worked so hard to make? How could a white baby keep wizardry and darkness alive in the land? You don't just belong to yourself, Ari. You belong to all the doom and dastardly and devilment in the world, and I'd never forgive myself if I let you forget what was right." and nothing that the desperate wizard could say would shake her. "I'll go as soon as I can get my things together," she said, keeping her voice steady with effort. "If I'm so white that I can ruin a powerful familiar like that, the further away I am, the better. Only I must say goodbye to Terence and give Rover back to him." She turned to Mr. Ledbetter and the ogre, who was standing miserably by the door. "By the way, where is Terence? I haven't seen him for ages." The ogre frowned. "He wasn't at the campsite," he said. "Are you sure?" said Mr. Ledbetter sharply. "He said he was going down to the campsite to get Belladonna's things and help the witches clear up. I was sure he'd spent the night down there. You know what boys are like with tents." And, their great sorrow laid aside for the moment, they all looked at each other with a new anxiety. Where was Terence? End of chapter 17. Chapter 18. Terence, at that moment, was locked in a small dark room with high barred windows in the place he feared and hated more than any other in the world, for the worst thing that could have happened had happened. Matron had become unrooted. She sent out the alarm. He'd been recaptured as he ran across the road to the campsite, and now he was back in the home. It had happened so suddenly that he had no chance to defend himself. A police car had been waiting outside the gates. Even policemen dared not go inside the gates at Darkington. 2 men had stepped out of the car and grabbed him, and before he knew where he was inside the car and driving at 70 miles per hour back to Toadcaster. The policeman had been quite kind, only telling him what a stupid thing it was running away. Children were always caught in the end, they said. Apparently a tradesman who delivered groceries to the home had seen Terence at the station on the day he went to find Miss Ledbetter and had noticed him buying a ticket back to Darkington. But if the policeman had been fatherly enough, Matron had received the woebegone little boy with a gloating triumph. She said nothing about the rooting. Most probably she had forgotten it. There is often a loss of memory after rooting, but she had not forgotten her grudge against Terence, and now, after a night spent on a lumpy mattress with only a bowl of claggy porridge for his breakfast, he was waiting for her to come and punish him. The door opened and Matron entered. She was yellower and more like a camel than ever, and she began at once. "Now then, what are we going to do with you? Beat you, send you to the Borstel, keep you locked up for good?" On she went, scolding and threatening, while Terence cowered against the wall and wondered why God hadn't given people earlids as well as eyelids so they could shut out such dreadful sounds. And all the while his anxious thoughts raced back to Darkington. Had Belladonna noticed yet that Rover had gone? Had Ahriman learned that Sir Simon was a fake? Would anyone miss him and try to find him? Or would they think he'd run away because he didn't like the hall? No, they couldn't think that. They couldn't. Matron was still standing over him, shouting and blustering, the stream of ugly words pouring out of her mouth like pitch. She'd have liked to hit Terence, to knock him against the wall, but there was a stupid health inspector who came around these days and made trouble. Once he'd actually had the nerve to tell her her methods were old-fashioned. Still, there were plenty of things he could do that didn't leave marks. Ugh, she's so horrible. A pinch under the wrist, for example. Matron had a special line of pinches. "So just you remember, my boy, one squeak out of you, one more bit of trouble, and you'll stay in this room for the rest of your life. Do you understand?" Terence nodded. In the few hours since he'd been back at the home, all his sparkle and bounce had gone. Terence could stand the blackest magic and enjoy it, but unkindness and spite just finished him. And so the greyness and misery of the home closed over Terence once again. By the time he'd eaten his boiled fish and black-eyed potatoes at the scrubbed dining table, had his fingernails inspected, and put on his mackintosh for the boring walk they always took when there was no school, past the Formica factory, left at the gasworks, and back down along the road of seedy terrace houses, he'd almost forgotten that only a few hours ago his life had been exciting and wonderful. But just as the line of children, led by the assistant matron, a watery lady called Mrs. Kettle, was crossing the road back to the home, a strange thing happened. Terence heard his name being called, and looking up, he saw Miss Ledbetter carrying a shopping basket and waving her umbrella. "Wait," she shouted. "I want to speak to you." She marched up to Terence, ignoring Miss Kettle, who was wittering away at the head of the line, and said, "Just the person I wanted to see. Though what you're doing here, I don't know. I thought you were staying with my brother." "I was," said Terence, "but they caught me." He looked at her eagerly. "If you could tell Mr. Ledbetter I'm here, please. I don't want him to think." "Come along, Terence Mugg, no loitering," called Miss Kettle sharply. But Miss Ledbetter, who had once thrown a drunk actor down 3 flights of stairs, was not at all cowed by Miss Kettle. "What I was going to say," she said, bending down and speaking quickly into Terence's ear, "was that I've just had a message from the hospital, from poor Monty Moon. He's so sorry he'd had to let you down. It was the van, the one belonging to the electrician. Monty said the tyres were torn to shreds, but he wouldn't listen. Anyway, they ran into a ditch on the way to Darkington, and the whole lot of them were taken to the hospital, just cuts and bruises. But poor Monty didn't really come around until this morning. It was last night, wasn't it, that he was supposed to do the show?" Terence looked at her in amazement. "Yes," he said, "it was last night. But he didn't let us down. He did the show. He was there." "No, he wasn't. Not Monty. He's been in hospital since Sunday, and the stage manager and electrician with him. He never got to Darkington at all. And that's what's worrying him, on account of having taken the £500. But now Miss Kettle had had enough. She left the front of the line, yanked Terence by his arms, and marched him away. Terence made no move to resist. He had too much to think about. If Monty Moon had never made it to Darkington, who had appeared from behind the tapestry? Who was the Elizabethan knight they had raised? Could it be... Didn't it have to be Sir Simon Montpellier himself? So Belladonna had really done it. But Rover hadn't been there, that was certain. The box Terence had handed Belladonna was empty, and without Rover, Belladonna was absolutely white. Where had all the darkness come from then? What did it mean? "Take your coat off, you lazy boy, and don't stand there dreaming," said Miss Kettle, who took her tone from matron. Terence didn't even hear. The afternoon darkened. The children had beans on toast. Miss Kettle read them a story from Struwwelpeter about a boy who had his thumbs cut off, and then they all trooped up to bed, lying in his iron cot, looking at the same crack in the ceiling that he'd looked at for years and years. Terence heard Billy in the next bed begin to sniffle and cry. "What is it, Billy?" asked Terence. "I'm thirsty. I want a drink." "Well, why don't you go and get one?" "I'm scared," said Billy. He was partly deaf and wet his bed and was always in trouble too. "I'll go," said Terence. He slipped out of bed and tiptoed out into the corridor toward the bathroom. Matron and Miss Kettle were talking in the hall below, and they were talking about him. "Of course, he's a troublemaker," Miss Kettle agreed. "But I've always felt, matron, that you dislike him particularly." "Dislike him? Of course I dislike him. And I've every reason to. Look." She held out her hand, and Miss Kettle peered at it. "The little finger, you mean?" "Yes," shouted matron. "The little finger I do mean. The little finger that Terence Mugg bit to the bone and mutilated when he was brought to me, a babe in arms, and I bent over to say icky, bicky, boo to him, like I do all my new babies. Even now I get shooting pains in it when I knit." "Goodness," said Miss Kettle. "And he was only 3 weeks old, wasn't he, when they brought him in from the kiosk? Most unusual. Everything about that horrible child is unusual. He gives me the creeps. Do you know, whatever you do to him, he never cries. Never. He'll sit there with his eyes like saucers and he'll wince with pain. But he's never shed a tear in all the time he's been here. It's unnatural, that's what it is. I'll knock it out of him, see if I don't. Oh, they're just so terrible." A sharp noise from the top of the stairs made them both turn around. Terence was standing on the landing in his pyjamas. He was standing perfectly still, as though in a state of shock, and the glass of water he'd been fetching for Billy lay in splinters at his feet. "How dare you, Terence Mugg? How dare you get out of bed? Just you wait. You've gone too far this time. You've gone too far." Terence waited. He felt very queer. There was a sort of roaring in his ears, and the landing felt as though it was rocking and swaying beneath his feet. Matron was on the first step, then the second. Now she was almost up to him, her arms outstretched to get him by the shoulders and shake him. Terence took a long, deep breath. He closed his eyes. And that's the end of chapter 18. Chapter 19. The Wizard Watcher, returning from a holiday it hadn't enjoyed at all, arrived at Darkington the following morning, and as all three heads agreed, it was like coming back to a blinking funeral. Ahriman and Belladonna sat hopelessly entwined on the big sofa in the black drawing room, gazing into each other's eyes. Belladonna had packed her straw basket and folded her tent and was only waiting for Terence to be found before going away forever to a life of loneliness, begonias and pain. Except that it was beginning to look as though Terence would never be found. Mr. Ledbetter, who'd quite forgotten that Terence wasn't actually his nephew, had rung every hospital in the district in case there had been an accident, but no one had any news of him, and the anxiety was dreadful. Meanwhile, the Kraken wasn't exactly helping by tottering back and forth, saying Daddy to Ahriman and Mummy to Belladonna, which is adorable, making both of them extremely wet. Nor did the wife slayer take any notice of the fact that everyone was upset. He pashed about, up and down, droning on about how he'd smothered Lady Beatrice, strangled Lady Mary, and knocked off Lady Henrietta with a halibut. It was to this scene of misery that the Wizard Watcher returned, and it made no bones about saying that it wasn't the sort of homecoming it had expected. Not that Ahriman wasn't terribly pleased to see it. He was, and immediately introduced Belladonna, whom the monster took to at once. "Very nice," said the middle head, looking her up and down. "Better than all those goose-pimpled girls at Brighton," said the left head, who had not felt really happy at the seaside. "When's the wedding?" asked the right head. But this, of course, started all the unhappiness off again, and the lovers went back to the business of sighing and looking into each other's eyes, leaving the ogre and Mr. Ledbetter to explain the events that had led up to this day. The Wizard Watcher did what it could to cheer everybody up, but after half an hour, during which the Kraken kept trying to climb up its tail, Sir Simon told it in horrid detail what Lady Olivia had said to the lavatory assistant, and Ahriman had declared for the 100th time that he would rather die than live without Belladonna. The monster had had enough. "Proper carry-on in here," said the middle head. "It's worse than Blackpool." "Let's go out and get some fresh air," said the right head. "Good idea," said the left head. "Get that little perisher off our tail anyway." And twitching the Kraken carefully onto the floor, the monster waddled out into the park. An hour passed. Mr. Ledbetter had made a list of police stations and was just about to pick up the phone to try again for news of Terence, when they heard the great oak door in the hall burst open with a resounding crash. Next came the sound of footsteps pounding upstairs. Then the drawing room door flew open as if pushed by a hurricane, and the Wizard Watcher came skidding into the room. Its heads were trembling, its eyes were ablaze, and they could actually hear its heart pounding in its chest. Never had anyone known the monster in such a state, and for a moment its excitement was such that it simply could not talk. Then the middle head began, and the other two joined in. "The new wizard cometh, he cometh right now, he cometh." Ahriman arose with shaking knees and went to the window, and everybody followed him. Stumbling with exhaustion, his small face lifted to the windows of the hall. Terence Mugg was coming up the drive. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20. "Are you suggesting we don't know our job?" said the middle head, looking very hurt. Yes, are you? I mean, you made us, said the left head. No, no, my dear fellow, said Ahriman, who knew how sensitive the monster was. It's just, well, you see, this is Ledbetter's nephew. We've all been rather anxious about him. Of course you haven't met him. You were away during the contest. But that's who it is. Mugg, Terence Mugg. That's his name. Terence was sitting next to Belladonna on the sofa. She'd rushed over, half carried him into the room, and was now feeding him with cauliflower soup and bananas, pale things she'd been able to magic up quickly until Lester could get to the kitchen and rustle up a steak. Now Terence stood up. Already being with the people he loved had made his cheeks glow and chased the weariness from his face. Actually, sir, he began, I think maybe, but here he broke off because it was so difficult to explain. He didn't really believe it himself yet and had walked all the way from Tokasta rather than try anything that might not work and prove him wrong. So instead he felt in his pocket and took out a piece of string, an apple core, an Indian rubber, and at last a blue tin punched with holes. Terence opened the tin. Inside it was a small spider with hairy legs and a black cross on her back. What is it? Asked Ahriman as they all craned forward. Terence swallowed. It's Matron, sir, he said. So then he began to explain, growing more confident as the story unfolded. And as he talked, it became quite clear. And the only surprising thing was that no one had ever suspected it before. He began by telling what he'd overheard at the home, and as he spoke, they could see the tiny baby carried in and snapping at Matron with his full set of teeth, so that she had hated him bitterly from the first day. They could see a small boy who never cried because wizards, like witches, cannot shed tears, but a small boy who knew nothing of his powers because, unlike Mr. and Mrs. Kanko, who had wisely encouraged their little Ahriman, Terence had grown up in a place where people were ignorant and blind. And then, when he'd first met Belladonna, Terence went on, he'd felt, not just that he loved her, everyone, said Terence, loves Belladonna, but a sort of feeling of belonging. And from the first moment when she'd tried to root Matron, Terence had said her spells along with her and worked with her and felt with her. Whatever she did, he said, I had to do it too. And sometimes I said extra spells of my own. Only I thought it was Rover. The blackness came from, well, we both did. I was sure it was Rover. But then I met Miss Ledbetter and she told me that Mr. Moon had never come up to the hall at all. He'd had an accident, but Sir Simon did appear. And I knew it couldn't be Rover because Rover had already gone, so... But this part was news to Lester and Mr. Ledbetter and gobbledygook to Ahriman and Belladonna, and Terence had to stop while everybody explained everything to everyone else. Ahriman was most displeased to think that his servants had tried to play a trick on him, but when they explained that it was only because they were so sure that Belladonna was the wife for him, he couldn't really make a fuss. Anyway, Terence went on, I couldn't understand what had happened because I knew Belladonna was quite white without the earthworm. So if it wasn't Rover and it wasn't her, who was it? And then when they said about me biting so hard when I was tiny baby, everything sort of clicked into place, and when Matron came charging upstairs to me, I just shut my eyes and, well, there she is. And he held out the tin inside which the spider was scuttling dementedly to and fro. The rejoicing after Terence had finished his story may be imagined. Belladonna hugged him and kissed him. Lester seized a sabre and gulped it down joyfully. In a single swallow, Ahriman came and pumped him by the hand. My dear, dear boy, what happiness, what joy, what a relief. Don't you see, all our problems are solved. You shall stay here and attend to wizardry and darkness, and Belladonna and I will be married and live happily ever after. Oh, Ari, so we can, cried Belladonna, rushing into his arms. It doesn't matter what colour our babies are now, does it? With a mighty wizard like Terence to take charge of things. Am I really going to be a mighty wizard? Said Terence, his eyes shining. Ahriman turned to him, his dark face serious for a moment. You have a great gift, my boy, he said. A great gift. Necromancy at your age. I couldn't have touched it. Why, if I called the thunder before the lightning, I was as pleased as Punch. No, it's my belief you're going to extend the frontiers of wizardry and darkness to unheard of depths. Of course, there's a lot of work before you, but you understand that, I'm sure. Oh, yes, sir. I'll work like anything. In the excitement and happiness which followed, everyone was careful to give the wizard watcher his due, and the useful monster sat there, contented, smiles on its faces, receiving the congratulation it knew it deserved. Yes, it is a relief, said the middle head, nodding graciously. No use pretending it isn't. Those 990 days just sitting there took it out of us, said the left head, not to mention the chilblains. Still, all's well that ends well, said the right head. There was only one slight snag, which Mr. Ledbetter, drawing aside his employer, pointed out to Ahriman. If Sir Simon's real, sir, which he seems to be, what's to become of him? Because it's my belief that if anyone else has to hear about Lady Mary or Lady Julia or Lady Letitia who guzzled, there'll be murder done, and it won't be him doing it. Ahriman nodded. A look of deep wickedness had come across his fiery eyes. Actually, Ledbetter, I have just the very neat idea about Sir Simon. A very neat idea indeed. But first we must have our wedding party. I want you to invite everybody, all the witches that took part in the contest for a start. Even the enchantress, sir? Asked Mr. Ledbetter, frowning. Ahriman smiled. Particularly the enchantress, he said. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21. The day of the wedding had dawned, and from all over the land there came kobolds and kelpies, goblins and nobles, fairies and fiends, to share the magician's happiness and to meet the new wizard whose coming had been foretold by the gypsy Esmeralda, and whose power was said to be greater even than Ahriman's own. No handsomer couple than the bridal pair could be imagined. Ahriman was in antlers and a gold-patterned cloak. Belladonna's ink-black dress was loose and flowing, and in her glorious hair she wore only a single simple bat. It was a little short-eared bat that had invented an aunt screw tooth for her at the coven, and it had flown up especially to be with her on her great day. In the centre of the table, on a blue velvet cushion that the ogre had fitted with a special sprinkler, lay Rover, looking rosy and peaceful now that it was understood that he was not a powerful familiar, but just an ordinary worm. Opposite him, in a high chair, sat the Kraken, squeaking with excitement. Belladonna had managed to put him into nappies in spite of his 8 legs, and with his underneath wrapped in snow-white muslin, he looked, as Terence said, almost like a bridesmaid or perhaps a page. Well, that's adorable. None of their friends had failed them. Mr. Chatterjee had flown back from Calcutta. The ghoul had left his slaughterhouse. Even Miss Ledbetter, though she didn't hold with magic, was there, bringing news of the Sunny Den Home's new matron, a fat and friendly woman who loved children. The old matron had been let loose in the rose garden, where she was making herself useful, eating aphids and all the other insect pests, as spiders will. And the other witches were there. However much they had sneered at Belladonna, now that she was Mrs. Canker and the Wizardess of the North, they were only too ready to be friendly. Ugh. Belladonna, of course, forgave them everything. Ugh. Not only that, but when the feasting and roistering had died down a little, she laid a hand on Ahriman's arm and said, "Harry, shouldn't we grant everyone a wish? Isn't that what you do at weddings?" "Well, my treasure, if that's what you want, of course, granting wishes isn't exactly black. Still, on such a happy day, we'll let Terence do it. It'll be good practice. It would take too long to tell you what all the brownies and kelpies and noggles wanted. And anyway, it was mostly money. Mr. Chatterjee didn't need to wish for anything because he tracked down the Princess Shari, the one who'd been made into a penguin, and was engaged to be married. The ghoul and Miss Ledbetter didn't hold with wishes, and Ethel Fleabag had fallen asleep with her head on her plate and couldn't be roused. But Mrs. Bloodwort knew exactly what she wanted. "It's that turning myself young again spell," she said to Terence. "I can't get it right myself, but you can. About 20 I'd like to be, or maybe 18. Gladys Trotter, the name was, and I'd like to be dressed nice." But when the wish had been granted and Mother Bloodwort stood staring into the mirror at the young girl she had been, a very odd look spread across her face. "I don't like it," she said at last. "I'm sorry, but you're going to have to turn me back again. All that swollen flesh, all those bulging pink cheeks, and what did I want with all that hair?" So Terence turned her back again, and the old woman went back contentedly to her shack, where she lived for many more years, being sometimes a coffee table and sometimes a witch, and not doing any harm to anyone because she'd forgotten how. After that, it was Mabel Rack's turn, and what she wanted was to have her legs turned back into a mermaid's tail. She was sick of them itching and sick of humping Doris about in a bucket, and she felt bad, she said, about the way she'd treated her aunts. For when all is said and done, water's thicker than blood, and you can't beat a wet family, said Mabel. So if you just drop me off at the bit of the cliff where I did my trick, I'll find them soon enough. So the wedding guests, glad to get some fresh air after all that eating, trooped off to the Devil's Cauldron, and Terence gave Mabel a splendid tail and 2 gill slits for breathing underwater, and Belladonna kissed Doris lovingly above her vile red eyes. And sure enough, as Mabel hit the waves, they could all see distinctly a set of plump and motherly arms pulling the witch and her octopus down into the foam. But when Nancy Shalter told the little boy what she wanted, Terence turned pale, for what Nancy wanted was no less than impossible. She wanted Terence to reverse the bottomless hole, to turn it inside out and see if somewhere in that bottomlessness her sister Nora might be found. "I don't know if I can do that," said Terence anxiously. But with Ahriman's hand reassuringly on his shoulder, he walked bravely to the east lawn, and the wedding guests followed. If anyone had doubted up until then that Terence was a great and mighty wizard, they did not doubt again, for Terence just walked up to the hole with its notices saying danger and keep out, and took them down. Next, with his shoes, he scuffed out the pentacle of protection, and then he stepped forward and spoke to the hole. No one heard the words that he used. What passed between him and it remains a secret for all time, but the hole obeyed him. It knew its master, and with a frightful scream, a roaring judder, and a fearful lurch, it gave up its bottomlessness, turned inside out, and from its new-found bottom dredged up the crumpled, bewildered body of Nancy Shalter's twin. "Nora," said Nancy, rushing forward and sending her chickens flying. "Nancy!" cried Nora, rushing into her sister's arms. Taking no notice of anyone, the 2 sisters stood there hugging each other and laughing with joy. "Then you look a proper mess," said Nancy Shalter. "You're all crumpled." "Of course I'm crumpled, you stupid stick," said Nora. "What do you expect? You shouldn't have pushed me in." "I didn't push you in, you fell." "I did not." "You did." And quarrelling happily, the 2 sisters picked up their chickens and walked away. But when Terence, carried shoulder high by the wedding guests, got back to the banqueting hall to grant the enchantress her wish, he found her chair empty except for a pair of moth-eaten stays which he had bought in the Portobello Road and poisoned in her parlour. Madame Olympia, it seemed, had returned to London, and with her had gone no less a person than Sir Simon Montpellier. "So my plan worked," said Ahriman gleefully, rubbing his hands. "I'll say it worked," said the ogre. "I put love potion in both their drinks, like you told me, and you should have seen them. The Pasha down on his knees, asking her to marry him and measuring her neck for a noose at the same time, and her accepting him and trying to get a squint at his moles to see how they'd look on a necklace. I nearly died." "A well-matched pair," said Ahriman. "I wonder which one of them will knock the other off first." He turned to Belladonna. "Am I not clever, my little kitten?" And Belladonna, gazing at him adoringly, said, "The cleverest person in the world." But the best part of the party is the bit where the guests had gone and the family is left alone, tired and content. Terence lay on the hearthrug, chatting to Rover. Lester was sharpening his bedtime sword. Ahriman had taken off his antlers, and he and Belladonna were curled up on the sofa making plans. They were going to build a little house on the other end of the park, quite close to the hall, but not too close, so that Terence would learn to manage on his own. Ahriman was going to write a book, and Mr. Ledbetter was already wondering how to stop the magician jumbling up the pages and getting the typewriter ribbon jammed and putting the carbon paper in the wrong way around. So happy and peaceful did everyone feel that it was quite a while before they noticed that the wizard watcher wasn't quite itself. Its round and beautiful eyes were suspiciously moist, and it was allowing the kraken to slide down its tail as though it didn't really care what happened. "Is anything the matter?" asked Ahriman. Now he came to think of it, the watcher hadn't really been itself at the party. It had hardly eaten anything, and talking had seemed an effort. The monster shook his head. "It's nothing," said the middle head in a low voice. "Not really anything," said the left head. "We're only making a fuss," said the right head. Drama queens. By this time, of course, everyone was desperate, and Terence, who had loved the monster from the moment he saw him, put down Rover and came over, quite pop-eyed with concern. "Please," said Ahriman, "you must tell us. That's what friends are for, to share things with." The monster sighed heavily. "Well," said the middle head, "it's obvious really, isn't it? I mean, what are wizard watchers for? They're for watching for wizards, aren't they? So when the wizard has been found," said the middle head, "there's not much more for us to do, is there? We're sort of spare. You could say useless, redundant, finished," said the right head, dashing away a tear. There was an absolute ghastly silence, while everyone took in the monster's grief and pain. Then Belladonna stepped forward, her eyes alight. "How could you be so foolish?" she said to the three heads. "Surely you know that wizard watchers aren't just for watching for wizards. They're also for watching over wizards. I thought everyone knew that." The monster lifted its head. "Terence might be a mighty and terrible wizard, but he's a very young one," Belladonna went on, while the little boy nodded eagerly. "And skinny at that," said the middle head. "Undernourished, you could say," said the right head. "Short of sleep, I wouldn't wonder," said the left head. "It's my belief that warm milk in the middle of the day wouldn't hurt," said the middle head. "Nor some hot soup at night. You can't beat hot soup, I always say. And plenty of fresh air." Everyone sighed with relief. The monster had withdrawn into the corner, busy and interested, and they could hear it working out a routine in which a young wizard could blight and smite and blast and wither, but sensibly. "You'll be all right now," said Belladonna, drawing the little boy close. And the wizard who in years to come would be known as Mug the Magnificent, Flayer of the Foolish, and Master of the Shades, looked up to her with shining mud-coloured eyes and said, "Oh yes, there'll be no one in the world as all right as me." And that is the end of chapter 21 and the end of the book. Pretty sure they lived happily ever after.